Who or what is behind wicked human behavior in Romans 1? Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel.
And here we go.
So recently I had an inkling to look at verse 32 in Romans chapter 1, which is the last verse within that chapter. And looking at this outline of our passage that we've been looking at all throughout these, 40 so videos, the passage, according to one scholar whose last name is Lee, he wrote a whole discourse analysis of the first half of Romans chapters 1 through 8. I used his discourse analysis and structure of this passage in the paper I wrote about 5-6 years ago. And here's his structuring of Romans 1:18 through 2:11. He says within this discourse analysis, there's two main units. The first one is from verse 18 to 32 in chapter 1, and the second main unit is found in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. So you have two halves, right? The first half, the first main unit, has three subunits, verse 18 to 23, number 1. Number 2 is verses 24 to 27. And then finally, the third subunit, verses 28 to 32. So verse 32 is not only the end of the third subunit, it's the end of the overall first main unit of Paul's argument that runs all the way to chapter 2, verse 11. All right, so this is where we find this verse. And at times it seems, at least in my experience, this could be an overlooked verse in terms of just what it says. Like all the good stuff, in some sense, comes before or after verse 32. And so perhaps this verse can and has been overlooked by some, many, myself. But for whatever reason, I was like, I think I need to at least kind of just look at what Paul says there and give it another look. All right. So here is that other look. And so with that, this passage, this verse 32, has 4 clauses. It says, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. All right, so there we have this one verse is broken up into 4 individual clauses. All right, and we're going to look at just 2 of those. The first two of these 4 clauses, which have 3 significant terms within them. This is what it looks like in Greek, and those 3 significant terms highlighted in red. Dikaioma, thanatos, which means death, and then axioi, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is roughly translated as worthy. All right, so these are those words, dikaioma, axioi, and thanatou, or righteous decree, worthy, and death. All right, and I think by looking at these 3, it's going to give us some significant insights, and just in terms of how to understand what Paul is saying, especially in light of everything we've looked at so far. Is it going to back up what we've been saying? Is it not? Is it going to go against it, etc., vice versa, and so on? All right, so let's see. Let's look at this first term. First term we're going to look at is death, or thanatos. I think I saw somebody say that it appears 22 times in the book of Romans. I go to Blue Letter Bible and I just look up, each time, this particular Greek word is found within the book of Romans. I believe it's 22 times. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments, right? But the first and last uses of this term are, verse 32 of chapter 1 is the first use. And then the last one is a familiar passage we've talked about on this channel, chapter 8, verse 38. All right. So the question is, though, that I want to pose, is this physical death that Paul's talking about? Is this eternal death, like a spiritual death? Or is it something else? All right, so is it those 3? Is it something else, etc.? So here we go. Let's try to answer that question. Here's something Beverly Gaventa had to say in her Romans commentary that just came out about a year ago. in the Old Testament Library series. She says this canvas involves all of humanity. I just threw that in there because that's her thinking as well. It's not just Gentiles, it's all humanity, which is significant. When the word death re-enters the letter in chapter 5, however, she says, it does so as a power by the name of death, capital D, that enters the world to take humanity captive. It is not at all unlikely that this notion of captivity to the powers is at work in chapter 1 as well, or as she's implying in verse 32. All right? Here's something else she said. Although earlier in Romans, death itself is an agent, one that establishes its reign over human life in chapter 5, paired with life here in Romans 8, it is a circumstance. In the immediate context, death refers to the circumstances that produce daily death dealing in the midst of life. Page 262. Now, one could argue, does death and life, that those pairings that come appear with several other pairings, such as angels and rulers, can death actually have that same metonymic quality as referring to the powers, just like angels and rulers, or not there? She says no. But in chapter 5, she says, yes, death and sin and death are metonyms referring to the supernatural evil powers. And chapter 1, verse 32, she's like, I think so as well. And if that's the case, then that's a very interesting and significant observation that changes the meaning from simply the death penalty that many people look at verse 32 and say, oh, if you don't follow God's righteous decree, then you get the death penalty, whether that's referring to the Torah death penalty or what have you. That seems to be the typical traditional way of understanding verse 32. But if Gavita is right, that kind of flips that on its head, and there's a little different way, I guess, you could then move forward with understanding that verse, and in light of everything that's come before it as well. But really interesting observation by Gavita there. So just like handed over to those three different things that Paul says in Romans 1, which serve as metonyms for the powers as well, she's like, hey, death also here starts off with that metonymic quality as well, referring to the powers once again. Pretty cool. All right. So like we just said, I'm going to read this. Perhaps death here doesn't refer to physical death, nor so much spiritual death per se, or the death penalty, but rather functions as another metonym referring to the same evil supernatural beings that humanity has been handed over to earlier in the passage, and juxtaposed here in verse 32 with God in the previous clause. All right? So it's juxtaposed God's righteous decree, death, or if you either live according to God's righteous decree or you live worthy of death, evil, supernatural powers. It's your typical Jewish two-way kind of way of living your life, either this way or the other. Maybe that's what's happening in verse 32. Can we support this way of looking at verse 32 and death beyond simply Gavita's observations? I don't know. Let's see. Let's look at the second word, and that's worthy. This word worthy is only found twice in all of Romans. It's found in verse 32, chapter 1, and then chapter 8 again in verse 18. So are we seeing, the question I want to pose here, are we seeing a comparison in both of these passages? Like we talked about, is death and living in such a way as a human being that you're just emulating the powers, or are you living such a way that you're living up to being an imager, you're living according to God, Yahweh's righteous decree? So are we seeing a comparison in both the passages that we see in verse 32 and in 8:18? Do we see behavior worthy of death in verse 32? Do we see behavior worthy of the glory of Christ in 8:18? All right, that's our question. What do we do? Let's figure it out. So here in chapter 8, verses 17 and 18, I believe this is NIV translation. We see, now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. It appears that Christian behavior is compared and contrasted to Christ's behavior, Christ's glory. If we act like Christ in terms of suffering as Christians, suffer the way he suffered, then we're going to experience the glory that is his glory to come for eternity. And if we don't, then we won't. All right. So there it kind of seems somewhat of a comparison contrast in some sense. And then we see in verse 32 something similar. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death or are worthy of death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Human behavior seems to be compared and contrasted here in this verse with God's righteousness, Yahweh's decree, Yahweh's Torah, versus living according to death's or the power's way of living and acting, which brings forth death, right? So death is a metonym for the powers because the powers produce death in human beings by influencing them to live wickedly, etc. All right. So, I mean, it looks like something like this is going on. It looks like it's a possibility to think of death here used as a metonym. And this term worthy, the two places it's found in Romans, as somewhat all helping us kind of see that as well, perhaps. I don't know. I'm throwing it out there. This is not an extensive, definitive, obviously study, but this is kind of a fun foray into verse 32 in this video. Now let's look at the third word. That third word is righteous decree or dikaioma. Now, what is this referring to? It appears 5 times in Romans. Verse 32, chapter 1, chapter 2, 26, and then twice in chapter 5, and finally in chapter 8, verse 4. It's interesting how all 3 of these terms appear in chapter 1, verse 32, and then all 3 of them, their last appearance is in chapter 8. Kind of cool. But BDAG, the Greek English lexicon, defines this usage of dikaioma in Romans 1:32 as a regulation related to just or right action, a regulation, requirement, commandment, especially of God's requirements. Okay? That's what BDAG says. Here's what N.T. Wright says in his book Climax of the Covenant from the early 90s. He says, dikaioma can perfectly properly bear the meaning the covenant decree, i.e. the decree according to which one who does these things shall live. Deuteronomy 30, 6 through 20. This is the just decree which belongs to the Torah, corresponding to the just decree which is issued negatively and referred to in 132. They know the dikaioma to theou, that those who do such things deserve to die. Here, N.T. Wright doesn't obviously take death as a metonym. That's kind of more of a recent observation by Gaventa. I'm not aware of anybody else who makes similar observations on Romans 1 that Gaventa does in terms of metonyms. But N.T. Wright talks about how this term dikaioma isn't the law itself or Torah itself, but how the Torah is an expression of God's righteous decree. All right. And so this comment by Paul is like harking back to Deuteronomy 30, verses 6 through 20. All right. And here's another quote later on in Climax of the Covenant by N.T. Wright. He says, simply by issuing the double dikaioma in Romans 1 and 8, the law results in death for those who are ensnared in sinful flesh, i.e. all human beings, though the law speaks specifically to the Jews. This dikaioma is God's own decree. The law is simply enforcing it. So dikaioma does not exactly, refer to the Torah, but the Torah is an expression of God's righteous decree, which is what I think he's saying here. The law, the Torah, is enforcing God's righteous decree that he's called, I guess, all humans to live by, in some sense. Okay, so thank you, N.T. Wright, for those insights on Dikayama. Here's something that's really cool. Here is where Dikayama is found in the Septuagint. Now, when you go to Blue Letter Bible, like I do, because I don't have Logos or anything yet, right now that is, you'll see that it appears, I believe, 125 times in the Septuagint. And guess which chapter it appears 7 times in? Deuteronomy 4. Deuteronomy 4, the same passage that Paul quotes earlier in Romans chapter 1, verse 23. All right? Only 5 chapters use the term Dikaioma in the Septuagint 5 times or more. And only 2 of those chapters have more than those 7 references found in Deuteronomy 4. Okay? So in terms of where Dikaioma is used most in terms of chapters, Psalm 119 is like far and away has the most uses of Dikaioma in the Septuagint, 28 times. And then you got Ezekiel 20, which uses it 8 times. Then it's Deuteronomy 4 at 7, Deuteronomy 6 at 6 times, and then 2 Kings 17 5 times. What's so interesting, outside of Psalm 119 using it the most, which is the longest chapter in the Bible, and it's all about how great God's word is, God's Torah, God's law, etc. The Septuagint uses Dikaioma as one of those synonyms for the Torah, or it's found. Let's just stick with it's found 28 times there in Psalm 119. But Ezekiel 20 and 2 Kings 17 are very interesting and similar in terms of it's just relating how Israel has sinned, committed idolatry against God's Dikaioma, God's Torah, and as a result, they're experiencing the consequences of covenant unfaithfulness, which eventually leads to exile, etc. Those 2 chapters are very similar, and I just find it really interesting to see where this term is used the most, and the fact that it's used here speaks a lot. And we'll kind of hone in on a few of those observations. But all in all, in terms of books of the Old Testament in the Septuagint, where this term is found the most, Psalms with 34 times. So it's only used 6 times outside of Psalm 119. But there's Deuteronomy right behind it at 28 times. So 28 times overall, this term is found in Deuteronomy. So it's a very Deuteronomistic, in some sense, term that Paul employs there in Romans 1. Then you got Ezekiel with 16, Kings at 10, and Samuel at 9. Okay. Just looking at this information, I think it's just like, oh, wow, it's just enlightening. And you got to do that with every term, I guess, you're studying. Like, hey, where is this term used in the rest of the book, in the rest of the New Testament, in the Old Testament, whether it's Hebrew or Greek, outside extra biblical writings, Greco-Roman writings, ancient Near Eastern writings, etc. This is just one of the things you got to do right when you study. You want to come to an understanding of what a term means in the context is, and this is enlightening. This was fun, and it wasn't that hard. Just blew our Bible and count up all the number of references. Okay, so what can we learn? What are some reenchanting observations that a look at these 3 terms in verse 32 of chapter 1 of Romans? What are some reenchanting observations we can make? Okay, number 1, references to Deuteronomy 4 are now seen in not only verse 23 where Paul quotes it, again he quotes Deuteronomy 4, not Genesis 1, are not only seen in verse 23, but now are also seen in verse 32. So it almost backs up and strengthens that Deuteronomy 32 worldview Heiser claim, the claim that Heiser made that Romans 1:18 and following is the best place or one of the best places to see the Deuteronomy 32 worldview at play in the New Testament, with Deuteronomy 4 being one of those four main Deuteronomy 32 worldview passages. So now it's quoted in verse 23, and now we see a significant term found from Deuteronomy 4, right there in verse 32. Okay, so that's one observation. Another one that I guess we could end with, so we keep this video pretty short, is that death functions as a metonym for supernatural evil. This might be pushed back against by many different people, but hey, I've got Gaventa saying this, so that's why I'm saying it. All right, so being worthy of death, if death is a metonym, kind of communicates more so that humans are acting like supernatural evil as conveyed by Paul in verses 18 through 31. Especially when you get to that exchanged, handed over terminology, when you are captive to the powers, captive to evil, you start acting like them, right? And so you act worthy of death. You act worthy of the powers. You act either worthy of Yahweh or worthy of the powers. And when you're handed over to the powers, then you start acting like them. And so that's what one of the things that I think we can draw from this verse and the use of death as a metonym, as mentioned by Gaventa. And therefore, not only is humanity acting like supernatural evil, based upon this phrase, worthy of death, it's being contrasted with living according to God's Torah and or Dikaioma from the previous clause of verse 32. And so, yeah, I think those are at least two things that we can draw from just looking at a couple of these three terms at the end of the third subunit of the first main unit, the end of the overall first main unit of that passage in Romans 1:18 through 2:11. And so this was a little fun. I think there's more to draw from it. There's more to look into that verse as well. But this was just, again, a little fun for Ray. As my curiosity was piqued in terms of like, man, I haven't really been looking at verse 32 much. What can we see there that might be like interesting to our endeavor here on this channel, or which is basically to understand the passage the way Paul intended it, understand the passage the way the original hearers heard it. All right. And understand this passage and what it seems to be saying that others aren't saying that it's saying. All right. And that's what's one really or main fun thing about this conversation we're having on this channel is not many, at least published works, are showing us that they're having this same conversation. When all of these other published works like Heiser and Govinda saying we need to have this conversation, but it's not happening in many different places, at least in published form. Well, hey guys, thanks for watching all the way to the end of this video. Hope you had fun learning a little bit more about Romans 1, verse 32. We will see you next time where we kind of dive into a little bit of both William Loder's writings as well as one recent publication that's titled Better Ways to Read the Bible. Until then, we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
And I stand by my performance.
He shall.